to give this session on open data. I'll just start by saying a little bit about myself and what I do in the university. So I'm the university's research data manager. I manage the research data service in the university. I'm based in the research engagement team in the library. And in essence, my role is to support good practice in data management. So I provide information and guidance on data management practice. We have a website with lots of information. I run a help desk service for inquiries and support requests. And I provide training as well to both research students through the research and development program and to staff through the people development training program. One of the things that I do for academics is I support grant applications. So some funders do ask for a data management plan as part of a grant application. Where that is a requirement, I will advise applicants and I will review the data management plan before the grant's submitted to help you optimize that part of the application. I also manage a couple of infrastructure services. So the university's research data archive, so that's our institutional data repository, and I'll be talking more about data repositories in general and that service in particular in the course of today's session. I also manage the REDCap data collection platform, which some of you may have encountered. So this is a secure research database service that's hosted by the university. It's used quite widely for the collection and management of participant research data. As I said, some of you may be familiar with that platform. So that's a bit about me. This is the homepage of the research data management website. So there's lots of information there about research data management. There's a section on preservation and sharing of research data, which is where we're going to be mostly discussing today. There are also contact details for the service on that homepage, and there's a booking link if you want to book an appointment with me. And that can be in person or online at your convenience. So that's a bit about me and about the university research data service. This is what I'm going to be talking about in today's session. So I'll start by discussing the answer to that question, why share data? So I'll talk about policies and expectations, principles of good research practice, and also the benefits of sharing data. The main part of my talk is going to be about the practicalities of sharing data. And then I'll talk a little bit about data management planning and I'll wrap up with some parting tips. So the talk should last until about 22, I would think. So there will be time for questions and answers and discussion at the end. And the slides, I will provide those to be circulated after the session as well, so you can follow up any information on them at your leisure. Okay, I hope that sounds all right. I will kick off straight away by considering why you should share your data. So let's be clear to start with what we're talking about when we talk about research data. So this can be quantitative and qualitative information that is collected to enable you to answer a research question. So quantitative data, it might be empirical data from experiments or observations. It might be computational output from computational research activities. Qualitative data, that might be things like interview or focus group data typically, or maybe images or video data. Data could also include information products, things like software and code that might be created as part of the research process and which might be necessary to enable the replication of your data or of your analyses. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about research data. And that definition, that actually comes from the university's research data management policy. And I've quoted on this slide really the keystone expectation that policy articulates, which is that data that substantiate published research findings, and that does include doctoral theses, must be preserved and made accessible using a suitable data repository wherever possible. So that's the basic policy expectation. We did actually, this policy, we have had a policy in the university since 2015, shortly after I joined the university. A first research data management policy was introduced. It was updated last year and refreshed. And so this comes from the latest iteration of the policy. And I want to highlight some other points from that policy as it has now been updated. So first, it does apply to students as well as to staff whenever they publish their research findings. And publication does encompass deposit of a student's thesis with the university in the Centaur Publications repository at the end of their program. So PhD students do need to be aware of this policy and of what they should be doing in order to comply with that. Secondly, the policy, it applies to this whole lifetime concept of research data management. So that's to say, data management is something that begins with research planning before you've even started your research. And it proceeds through the active collection and management of data during your research project. And it follows through to the long-term preservation and sharing of data when you complete the research and you communicate your research findings. And I think it's important to keep this perspective in mind, because when you share, whether you can share your research data, and if so, how you can do that, and the quality of the data that you share, all those things depend on decisions you make and on actions that you take before you even get to the point where you should be sharing the data, which is typically towards the end of the project. So you do have to be thinking about data management, about data sharing before you've even started your research project. A third point is this policy, it takes the position that data should be made as open as possible when you complete the research and publish your findings. And for that purpose, a data repository, wherever possible, should be used as the means, as the vehicle for preserving and sharing your data. That's a dedicated service that exists for the purpose of preserving and sharing data. So it should always be used wherever possible. The timing of data sharing is also important. So data should be accessible to others by the time that you go on public record with your research findings, i.e. when you'll publish your research. And that's because data provide the evidentiary basis for those findings, the means by which the findings can be verified independently. So emphasizes that almost all data can be made available on some basis, and that might be as open data, or if the data are considered of higher risk or maybe sensitive in nature, there may be a controlled access option that can be used, which is a feature provided by some data repositories. So that's another key point. Although we are talking about open data here, not all data can or should be made open, but there are still ways in which data can be made accessible to authorized users on a restricted basis, even if they can't be disseminated as open data. So it might be helpful to think in terms of a spectrum of openness rather than a simple binary between closed and open. Okay, so I've talked about university policy. One thing I want to emphasize is that that policy is very much aligned to the sector. Any research intensive university in this country will have a data sharing policy, typically the same things as we say in ours. And that reflects the expectations of public funders of research that fund a lot of the research activity that goes on in this university as in other universities. And their basic expectation is that publicly funded research data should be made available with as few restrictions as possible. And I've highlighted here some policies from funders that fund a lot of research in this university. So those of UKRI, the EU through its Horizon Europe programme, the Royal Society, the British Academy, and the Wellcome Trust. And all those policies, all those funders, they have research data policies. And for good reason, because they see data management and sharing as part of good research, and they expect the researchers they fund to adhere to those standards of good practice. University policy, it also reflects the expectations of many publishers. So you may find that when you publish your research, the journal you publish with expects you to make your data available. They may ask you to deposit your data in a suitable data repository and to reference the data from the article by means of a data availability statement. And I've just put on this slide a few policies from some publishers. So good practice, which many publishers encourage or expect, is for a data availability statement associated with an article to reference the data by means of a digital object identifier, typically, or other unique URL that links directly to the data set in a data repository. Usually the data availability statement will be found either at the head of the article or somewhere around the acknowledgements or the references at the end of the article. So this is something all of you can do. Get into the habit of looking for a data availability statement when you're reading articles that are reporting research which has involved the collection of research data. So see if you can find that statement. Does it tell you if the data are available? And if so, does it tell you how they can be accessed? Does it link directly to the data? Is that link a DOI? So does it link to the data held in a data repository? And this is something for all PhD students and also all staff who are supervisors of PhD students. So this is the PhD deposit form. When a research student completes their PhD, an electronic version of the thesis has to be deposited in Centaur, the university's publications repository, where it will be available for others to access and read. So that's part of the process at the end of the PhD program. And the student will need to complete this thesis deposit form as part of that process. And one section of that form addresses data availability. That's section F on the form, and it says basically this. So the student is expected to deposit supporting data in a data repository and provide a data availability statement in the thesis form. So that's something that PhD students should be planning for, and supervisors should be making sure that they're aware of this and taking appropriate action to prepare and share their data when they complete their PhD program. So that's an overview of the policy framework, the expectations for data sharing in the research sector and at this university. And those policies, they do exist with good reason. So data sharing is important because it's part of good research practice. And that's good in both the ethical and the qualitative sense. So transparency with the evidence that supports findings placed on the public record demonstrates good research practice, demonstrates research integrity. It also enables the verification and replication of those findings by allowing them to be independently validated against the evidence on which they're based. And data can also have a useful life beyond the original research project for which they were created. So they might potentially be used by other researchers to answer different research questions. They might be used by yourself in future research activities. They might have other sorts of uses, perhaps to support teaching and learning, maybe to support evidence-based policy making in some areas. In other areas, perhaps to support the development of products and services. And that leads to a third point, which is if data are reused, if they generate impact or if they generate further research, then you also benefit because credit is returned to you in the form of citation and recognition as the source of the data. I will also mention on the subject of self-interest, this rather interesting piece of research. So this indicates that there may be a citation advantage to data sharing. So that's to say, if you link your published work to underlying data in a data repository, your work might receive significantly more citations than if you just published the research without sharing the data. And that makes sense if you think about it. If you're giving the users of the research greater confidence in the findings, then they might be more inclined to cite those findings as being evidenced as trustworthy because the evidence they're based on is available. And you're making another research output available, so you're increasing the likelihood that one or other of those outputs might be used by others. So that's a brief overview of some of the reasons why you should think about sharing your data. I'm now going to move on to the practicalities of data sharing. So I'm going to start with the FAIR data principles. Does anybody here know what FAIR stands for? And Evangeline and Etienne are not allowed to answer. FAIR is an acronym. Do we have any suggestions? Does anybody know what they mean? Bindable, interoperable, accessible, reproducible. We're nearly there. We're very close. So they do stand for findable, accessible, interoperable, and not reproducible, close, but reusable. So this acronym represents these basic principles. Yes, not bad. I almost give that to you, Beth. So these principles, they were published in 2016, and they're now very widely referenced as a standard framework for the management and sharing of research data. So you may well see them referred to quite often in discussions around data sharing and data management. And what they entail really is that the data, or at least information about the data, need to be published and they need to be managed in certain ways. And the way to ensure that happens is to use a data repository. So the data repository is really fundamentally the basis on which data can be made fair. So this is what we're talking about today. So a data repository is a service that exists to preserve, to publish information about, and to provide access to data. It's typically an institutionally managed service, so it's managed by an organization. So that might be a research performing organization like a university, or it might be an organization serving a community like the UK Data Service, for example, that is a National Social Science Data Service, which also has a data repository. So among other things, what a data repository will do, the basic essential functions, it will publish an online metadata record for a data set so that it's discoverable. In most cases, the repository will assign a digital object identifier, or a DOI, to a data set. So that's a unique identifier that can be used to cite and link to a data set. And you'll all be familiar with DOIs, which are assigned to the articles that you read. They work in exactly the same way with data sets. So the important thing about the DOI is that it is unique. It uniquely identifies a defined specific object, and it's persistent. So it will always resolve to the landing page for that item. And that makes that item a citable entity. That means it's something that can be referenced and linked to over time. The repository will also do other things. It will obviously provide the means to access the data themselves and any supporting documentation. And the dataset information will tell you important things. It will tell you who created the data, so who owns it. It will provide a license notice to grant other people permission to use it. So those are all the things that a data repository will do. This is a screenshot of a data set in the university's research data archive. So that's the landing page for that data set. And I'll just highlight how that maps onto that FAIR framework. So in the first place, it's findable. So here you might be able to see, I don't know, it's quite small perhaps, but there's a citation for the data set at the top of that record, and that includes the assigned DOI. You can see on that page there's a metadata record providing a description of the data set that's indexed in search engines and also in the DataCite metadata store. So DataCite is the authority that assigns DOIs, and it basically stores the metadata for all the items to which those DOIs have been assigned, and that metadata is openly published. It can be accessed by discovery services through APIs. So that basically makes the data set discoverable. It is accessible, so the metadata is published on its own permanent landing page at a unique URL, and the files are available for download from that page. It's interoperable, so the metadata on this page, they conform to a defined resource description standard, and the data themselves, they're in a CSV format, so an open file format. It's not dependent on proprietary software to be opened and read, so that maximizes its accessibility. And its reusability, so it's reusable. So the data are published under an open license, in this case Creative Commons attribution, that allows the data to be freely used, modified, copied, redistributed by anyone for any purpose. The only requirement is that the creators have to be credited if those data are reused. And there's rich provenance information in the metadata itself, so it tells you who created the data set, who the rights holders are, and the data files include documentation describing the research context, the methods used, containing a code book of the variables that are included in the data. And again, both the data and metadata, they're in standard reusable formats. So that illustrates the essential features of a data repository and how it enables data to be fair. But the next question might be, what data repository should you deposit your data into? And that may not at first sight be a straightforward answer. There are lots of data repositories. There may possibly be different data repositories that you could deposit your data into. This university, it doesn't require you as a member of the university to use our data repository. Funders and publishers often don't require the use of specific repositories, although they might make recommendations as to appropriate services. So it can seem at first sight quite confusing, but actually you can identify an appropriate repository for your data using some basic guidelines. So in the first place, we can recognize three broad categories of repository. So you have subject area or data type specific repositories, like the UK Data Service for social science data, which I mentioned previously. There's a repository called Open Neuro that is dedicated solely to collecting neuroimaging data. And there's another repository called the CEDA archive. CEDA is the Center for Environmental Data Analysis. It's a NERC facility, and this is a data repository that's basically dedicated to collecting climate and weather data, and there's a lot of that generated at this university. So those are subject or data type specific repositories. The second category of repository is your institutional repository, so such as the university's Research Data Archive here. If you're at another university, the chances are that university would also have its own institutional data repository. And then there are general purpose data sharing services, things like Figshare or Zenodo, which some of you may have heard of. These are public services, they're free to use. Anybody can deposit data into those. Most of those services almost all of them are free to use, by the way. So when you're considering which repository is the best place for your data, the general advice is to consider appropriate repositories in the order listed here. So where they are available and suitable, use subject or data type specific repositories. They're community resources. They generally provide a high level of data curation, and they may also implement standards for data description or formatting that help to make data fair, especially interoperable and reusable. There's generally more of that kind of repository in the sciences, although the UK Data Service is a good example of a resource that accepts a wide range of human subject data across the social science and also a biomedical remit. So they will accept biomedical behavioral data, that sort of thing. It also has a very useful safeguarded data option, which is an option that can be used for higher risk anonymized data, controlled access option, as I mentioned a little earlier. Second option is your institutional repository. So that will accept any type of data. It will apply basic quality controls to ensure your data meets a minimum standard. We will also risk assess data, for example, to check that they've been anonymized properly. And that's a good solution for most types of data. We handle both open data and restricted data sets. The third option is the general purpose data sharing service. For example, Zenodo is provided by the EC as a repository for its funded outputs, but it's also made freely available for public use. Figshare is a commercial product, but it does have a freemium model. So to all intents and purposes, for individual users, it's freely available. Those are effectively self-publishing services, so there isn't any quality control. What you deposit gets published as is. I generally encourage people to use a service that has a review process, so that there is some quality control and risk management built in to the deposit process before anything gets published. But there's nothing to stop you using Figshare or Zenodo if that's your preference. Those services, they're only suitable for open, freely available data. So I really recommend that you think at the research planning stage about which data repository ultimately you're going to deposit your data in, and that you check that repository's guidelines for depositors. They may have specific requirements, for example, regarding formats that the data should be submitted in, or documentation that they ask the data to be accompanied by. We do provide guidance on the Research Data Management website in the preservation and sharing section on how to choose a suitable repository for your data, and you can see the link on that slide. And of course, you can always contact us as well if you require advice on that point. The basic deposit process with any repository involves you creating a metadata record describing a data set and uploading the data and documentation files. That data set is then published, either following a review process or immediately if you use a service like Zenodo or Figshare. That basic process is going to be pretty much the same whatever repository you use. So I'm just going to take the University Archive as an example here. In the first instance, you log in to the service using your university account, and you will then have an option to create a new data set. Oops, there's a create a new data set button sort of positioned in the middle of the screen there. If you select that, then you initiate a new deposit process. And this will take you through a sequence of pages where you add metadata describing the data set. So here, for example, on the first page, you're adding a title and a description for the data set, similar to an abstract that you might write for an article, but in this case, describing the data set. You'll also, as you go through the sequence of pages, you'll add more information, for example, identifying the people who created the data set, the rights holders in the data set, and any related publications that you want to link the dataset to, and so on. On the last page, you upload your dataset files, and here you can also choose what license notice should be associated with each file. So we provide a selection of standard license notices that you can select. The default is Creative Commons Attribution, which is the same license that's widely used for open access publications. We recommend that for open data as well. There are other options available if needed. You can also specify your own custom license if you need to. You can also choose to embargo the files. Some repositories offer this option. Our university repository does. So this might be useful if you don't want them to be accessible immediately when you publish the record, the metadata record describing the data set. If you want them not to be available, for example, until the point where your article is published. So you can deposit the data in advance, but not make them immediately accessible. So once you get to the end of this workflow, you deposit the data set, and then it will come to us for review. And we might ask for more information. We might ask you to make some changes to the data set or the documentation. We can send the item back to your archive work area for you to edit and then deposit it again when you're ready. So we might cycle through that process perhaps once or twice until we get to the point where we're happy to approve the data set for publication. It's then approved and published, and we register the DOI, and so then you have your preserved, shared, and citable data set. And you can see a screenshot of a data set published in the archive here. It's probably a bit small, but you might see a grayed out area at the top. That's a copy and paste citation that includes the DOI, which has been assigned to the data set. So that DOI uniquely identifies and links to that data set. So you can copy and paste that citation into your data availability statement, into your list of references. There is a field on the right below the file listing called Related Centaur Publications. And in that, there's a link to, in this case, it's a PhD thesis that has been deposited in Centaur. If the data supported an article, then we could link to the record for the article in Centaur. You might also be able to see that underneath the files, they're shown with a request data text underneath each file listed in parentheses. And that's because these files have been placed under embargo, as has the deposited thesis that they link to. So the embargo will expire at the date when the thesis embargo has been set to expire. And you can do the same thing, as I've said, with data related to publications. So you can deposit them in advance and embargo them until your article is published online. There is guidance on how to deposit data with us on the archive webpage, and that includes a short video walkthrough and a step-by-step instructions document. There's guidance on depositing restricted data sets if you do have sensitive data that you're interested in preserving. And you can also contact us if you want a pre-deposit consultation, and there's a booking link from that page as well. One of the things that we do ask for data sets deposited in the Research Data Archive is a documentation file providing information to support reuse of the data. So this is the R part of the FAIR acronym. So data need to be documented, and they need to be interpretable to be reusable. And that's why we ask for a documentation file to be submitted with every data set that's deposited. We do provide a README template, and that takes you through the sorts of information that you'd want to include in your documentation. So that's available as a text file for download from the archive webpage. And most of our depositors use that as the basis for their documentation. I will also highlight our Preparing for Data Archiving webpage. So when you're at the stage of preparing data for deposit in a repository, you can refer to this checklist that we provide. It takes you through the key things that you need to do and consider when you're preparing a data set for deposit in a repository, and that would be useful whatever repository you're planning to deposit in. So it covers making sure that you've got consent for data sharing if you've collected data from participants, identifying the creators and rights holders in a data set, deciding how you will license the data, and obtaining permission to share the data from rights holders if necessary. It also provides some tips on how to prepare the data set and supporting documents so that your data set is well formed and easy to use. One thing that I wanted to pick up in particular from that guidance is advice around sharing of data from research participants. And what I want to emphasize here is that in almost all cases, data collected from participants can be shared on some basis. That might be as open data, which would usually be anonymized, or it might be using a repository that provides a controlled access procedure. And both the UK Data Service and the university's Research Data Archive offer controlled access archiving options. The important thing to consider if you are collecting data from participants is making sure that you're recruiting on an appropriate basis and that you're advising them appropriately about your data sharing intentions. So I've put on this slide examples of what you should not say on a participant information sheet where you discuss what will be done with the participants' research data. So please don't tell your participants that the research data collected from them will not be shared, or that you will destroy all of the data that you've collected from them at the end of the project. We have had to reject deposits in the Research Data Archive because researchers have said these things on their participant information sheets, and their participants have consented to take part in projects on the understanding, for example, that the data would be destroyed at the end of the project. So do think carefully about what you're telling your participants. If you're using an information sheet that someone else has shared with you, review its wording carefully. Be very aware of what you're actually telling your participants and modify the text if necessary. So this is the sort of thing that you should be saying. If research data are going to be anonymized and shared as open data, then something like the research data we collect from you will be preserved and made available in anonymized form so that they can be consulted and used by others. If they're going to be archived as controlled data, then the second statement on this slide would be appropriate. And those statements can also be reformulated for your consent form as I understand statements. So I understand that the data collected from me in this study will be preserved and made available in an anonymized form, and that, etc. So examples of appropriate statements for the consent form, they are included in a sample consent form that's provided by Information Management Policy Services, and there's a link to that on the slide. So you can refer to that as guidance on good practice for your consent forms and the sorts of wording that you should include in your information sheets. Okay, I'm just going to start bringing this talk to a close well, this part of the talk, and then I'll just move on to a final part. So when should you share your data? That's another question that you need to think about. The basic principle is that the data necessary to validate your research findings should be accessible to others at the point those findings are placed on public record. So that might be when you publish a research article. In the case of research students, when they deposit the electronic version of their thesis with the university. So the time to deposit data in a repository is when you're completing research and preparing a publication. For PhD students, we recommend they deposit when they're preparing the thesis to submit for examination. The reason for this is because the student should include in the thesis a data availability statement that links to the data in the repository. So you deposit the data in the repository. The repository publishes the data and an online metadata record. It assigns a DOI to the data set. You can now include a data availability statement with your article or thesis, referencing and linking to the data using the DOI. And the last step is to ensure the data are accessible by the time the publication is online. So the University Archive, as I said, that will allow you to embargo a data set until the related publication is available. Other repositories may also offer this feature. Not all do, but some do. The UK Data Service, for example, does, and the CEDA Archive for climate and weather data also does as well. So it's worth checking the repository policy if that's something that you want to be able to do. Okay, I'll just round off now by saying a little bit about planning ahead. So data sharing is something that happens at the end of the research project when you communicate your findings, but preparation for data sharing, as I've said, really begins before you've even started your research project. So as I've just shown, for example, what you tell your participants when you recruit them may determine if and how you can share your data that you collect from them. And the best way to plan effectively is by writing a data management plan for your project. And that's a structured document that records what data will be collected in a project, how the data will be managed during the project, and how the data will be preserved and shared at the end of the project. There are lots of different aspects of data management that you'd need to consider. A data management plan gives you a structured way of thinking about all of those elements in a systematic way. So on this slide, that's a fairly standard schema for a data management plan. Those are the sorts of things that you would probably cover within a data management plan. What I would stress is that this really should be a practical tool that helps you deliver an effective and good quality research project and to prepare for the preservation and sharing of data at the end of the project. So if you're systematically documenting your data as you collect them, it will be a lot easier to create the supporting documentation when you come to deposit your data in a repository. And that's why some funders ask for a data management plan to be included with grant applications. It's also why, as of next year, new PhD students are going to be required to submit a data management plan as part of the confirmation of registration process. And that data management plan will have to be reviewed and signed off by the supervisor. And we're introducing that policy because data management and sharing, really, they're fundamental research practices, and every researcher in training should be learning and applying them. We do provide resources to help with data management planning. So there is a section of the website on data management planning that includes templates that can be used. For research students, we provide a PGR data management plan template, and there's also that's provided as a Word document, and it's got some guidance, supporting guidance from this web page. There's also a checklist that supervisors can use to review students' data management plans. So, oops. I'll just wrap up here now with my take-home messages. So, first of all, data should be made as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. The sharing of data is a requirement of university policy wherever possible, and also of many publishers and funders. It's basic good research practice. Second, almost all data can be shared on some basis, even if it's not suitable for open sharing. So you can use your consent process, you can use anonymization and redaction of data. If necessary, you can use a controlled access repository to enable you to share data. And that applies to both qualitative and quantitative data. In most cases, it's possible to share those data on some basis. Third, always use a data repository to share data. It supports management of data in accordance with those FAIR principles, and it will ensure long-term preservation and accessibility of the data. And fourth, ensure data are available by the time the research findings are placed on public record. Some repositories, as I've pointed out, have embargo functions, so you can deposit data in advance before making them publicly available. My second set of tips are about making sure you take the long view about data sharing. It begins when you're designing your research project. It's not just something that happens at the end of the project. So write a data management plan for your research. We have tools and a template on our website that you can use. Research students, I would encourage them to share their data management plan with their supervisor for them to review, and keep the data management plan updated throughout your research. It's only going to be of benefit to you if it's kept up to date and referred to on an ongoing basis. If you are collecting data from participants, make sure you're notifying them appropriately of the intention to share data. So don't tell them that data won't be shared or will be destroyed at the end of the project. And finally, plan ahead for data preservation and sharing. So identify the repository you expect to use, factor in time to prepare the data for archiving towards the end of the program. And remember, we have guidance on preparing data for archiving, but also that it's going to be a lot easier to do that at the end of the project if you're managing your data well throughout the course of the project. And that brings me, I think, to the end of my talk. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has.
Thank you very much, Robert. I'm going to stop recording now.